First of all, maybe you can help our audience understand what was WorldCom and what was your role at WorldCom.
First, thank you, Cass, for your kind words, your support, and for all that you and Bennett are doing. I've loved watching your podcast. I'm actually going to go back to the beginning and watch all the way through. Very important work. So I was the vice president of internal audit for WorldCom. I reported directly to the chairman of the audit committee and dotted line to the chief financial officer. So just to kind of let you know where I came from, I didn't walk in with a fully staffed department. Over an 8-year period, I built the department to some 40 internal auditors in Asia Pac and Europe and different locations in the United States. And to give you just kind of a high-level view of WorldCom, back in the 90s, so we're going way back, WorldCom was really this rocket ship that was on a one-way path up. And WorldCom was constantly setting records. So when WorldCom acquired MCI, it was the largest acquisition in corporate history. WorldCom floated 2 of the largest debt offerings in history. Scott Sullivan, the CFO, was at one point the highest paid CFO in the country. And he was given the CFO of the Year award by CFO Magazine for his work in mergers and acquisitions. Bernie Ebbers, our CEO, was on the cover of Business Week, and he was dubbed the telecom cowboy. He wasn't your typical suit and tie CEO, so he was most often seen, walking around the office in blue jeans and cowboy boots and chewing on this long, unlit cigar. So at 6'4", he really had this power and presence that would absolutely fill a room. And he graduated in physical education, started out coaching and teaching 7th graders, and just kind of happened into the long distance industry and built the company through growth, acquiring one company after another, and bought 60 companies in less than 2 decades. So you can imagine what that does to a company's internal control environment. WorldCom didn't have one billing system. We had 60 plus billing systems, 11 accounts receivable systems. So it was really this patchwork of all these very entrepreneurial startup companies that were brought together. And ultimately, he grew the company to $38 billion in revenue. WorldCom was the second largest long distance company, second to AT&T. And through the acquisition of UUNet, at one point controlled the bulk of the internet backbone.
You mentioned there that they acquired all of these companies in this very short period. Can you talk a little bit about why Bernie wanted to grow WorldCom through acquisition and how that resulted in some of these mismatches and lack of internal controls?
Great question. Bernie, when he started out, he actually started in the motel business. And he wanted to expand and buy other motels, but they didn't have the capital. And so the government had deregulated the telecom industry, and he and some of his buddies got together and said, hey, let's hang out a shingle and start this long distance company, and we'll resell AT&T service. So basically, we'll buy minutes from AT&T at a low rate, we'll resell them at a higher rate, we'll take the cash, and we'll buy another motel. Pretty quickly, actually, the long-distance company, LDDS was the name of the company at the time, began to go south. It was headed for bankruptcy. And so some of the other investors asked Bernie, hey, can you come in and spend half of your time on WorldCom or LDDS and half of your time on the motels and try to save this company? So WorldCom was growing very rapidly, which meant that our stock was trading at a much higher price-to-earnings ratio than our peers. And so that allowed WorldCom to acquire companies much larger in size. So MCI was 3 times larger than WorldCom. And so it gave him the leverage to buy bigger and bigger acquisitions. He was a deal maker, right? But he also was a huge risk taker. And in the end, it really became like the gambler's curse. It was unbridled risk taking. He basically did the same thing in his personal life that he did with WorldCom.
He was a risk taker doing all these mergers and acquisitions. Ultimately, the last final hurrah was the attempt to purchase Sprint, which still exists, I guess, which I think at the time was going to be one of the largest mergers or acquisitions in history. But along with that, as you're saying, in his personal finances, he was leveraging all the stock options that he had, and he was using those to buy rice farms and yacht building companies and the largest ranch in North America and timberland, hundreds of millions of dollars of stuff. All of this looks great when it's going up.
That's a very interesting story, a pretty risky retirement strategy. So Bernie was moving closer to retirement, but he did not want to exercise his options or sell his stock to diversify. And in fact, if you read the book, Extraordinary Circumstances, my book, I talk about the fact that he really didn't want anybody in the company to exercise their stock. In fact, he held almost all of his stock until the bitter end. And his defense attorneys used that in court. They said, if he held his stock until the end, how could he possibly have known that there was a fraud going on in the company? In fact, when he left the company to try and liquidate some of his holdings and repay some of his loans, he took the last couple $1 million he had and he bought more WorldCom stock. Basically, Cassie went to the bank. He took out something like $1 billion in margin loans, and he put up his stock options as collateral. So just like you said, as long as the price is going up, everything's great. But if it starts to tick down, there's a problem. And that's exactly what happened. So when the dot-com bubble burst in March of 2000, and then the telecom bubble burst in September of that year, the price started ticking down, and he got a margin call from the bank. I think it was for $50 million. And it's not until you're way down the road that you realize that the bubble's burst. When you're in the midst of it, people think, well, this is just a temporary downturn in the market. And so the compensation committee said, look, we'll loan you the $50 million to cover your margin. He could have sold some of his stock, exercised his options, but they didn't want him dumping his stock on the market because that would drive the price down further. So they said, when the price turns around next quarter, you can just repay the loan. But of course, you guys know, right, Bennett, that it never turned around. And so he got one margin call after another. And ultimately, WorldCom loaned him some $400 million. It's the largest loan given in corporate history. And at that time, pre-Sarbanes-Oxley, it was legal. It was reported to the public. Just because something's legal doesn't mean that it's ethical or the right thing to do. And that's a prime example of that. So you can imagine that the pressure that put on Bernie Ebbers. It's not easy to find a buyer for $600 million worth of timberland if you're having financial difficulties. He kept going back to the table in his personal life, right, buying bigger and bigger and bigger. It was this insatiable appetite. And he did the same thing with the company.
Bernie Ebbers had diamond hands when there was no such thing, no such term.
One thing you mentioned there that was really striking to me when I was reading Extraordinary Circumstances is that he didn't want anyone else to sell and would get lists of employees and insiders who had exercised their options or who had sold their stock. And that when you chose to sell some of your stock to diversify, he even called you out during a meeting about it. What kind of effect do you think that had on the culture of WorldCom?
He viewed holding your stock, I believe, as a sign of loyalty to the company. And he started this company, right? He was one of the founders and he believed in it. In fact, he gave everyone in the company stock. He wanted everyone to, share in ownership. And, at one point you look out at the parking lot and you see all the old dilapidated cars start to disappear and it starts to fill up with Mercedes and BMWs. And so everybody is making money in WorldCom stock. The water cooler conversation is, well, when do you sell your stock? And I can remember my father, he was always telling me, you need to diversify. And I was like, I had all of my 401k in WorldCom stock until the end. Listen to your parents. No matter how much you believe in something, it is important to make sure you diversify.
Considering you were heavily invested, a lot of your coworkers were heavily invested, and Bernie was heavily invested and levered up. What ended up transpiring to bring this all down? I know you don't ultimately think it was the fraud itself that brought it down, but maybe that helps expedite the process.
The way I look at it is I think the fraud really masked the true state of the business and that WorldCom probably should have gone into bankruptcy long before it did. If you look at the failure of WorldCom, yes, there was a failure from a fraud perspective, but there were also some failures from a business perspective. If you look at the market, and it wasn't just WorldCom, you have to look at the whole telecom industry and the dot-com industry of what was happening. The internet was being commercialized, and you had a lot of cheap capital. Venture capitalists were throwing money at any company that had .com connected to it. And so it was this kind of winner-take-all, right, ideology in the .com industry and the telecom industry. Telecom was deregulated. And so you had all of these new entrants. Even Enron was wanting to get into the telecom game. And so they were rushing into the market. You had cheap capital. They were placing billions of dollars in orders with WorldCom and AT&T and all these big telecom carriers because there was this belief that the first person who got their network built out and got the end user customers would win the day. It was all just a big mirage. From a telecom perspective, there simply were not enough end user customers to support all of these networks that had been built out, which comes back to the point about making sure that the assumptions that are driving a market or a business's strategic decisions are valid. And then when the bubble burst, that's where the pressure to commit fraud came from. WorldCom's revenues started to decline. All of these companies that had placed orders with the big carriers back in the 90s just started going bankrupt, one after another, and canceling their orders with the big carriers. And so in 1999, if you looked at the backlog of orders for the big carriers, it was just unprecedented. None of them could keep up with the orders. In fact, a lot of customers were placing orders with multiple carriers to see who could provision the service first. So it was just this Wild West gold rush environment. And that's what drove the industry to its heights. And those poor strategic decisions, spending billions to build out the network, over leveraging, and then signing leases with third parties for telecom fiber in places where WorldCom did not have their own network. They signed these 3 and 5 year operating leases, which are supposed to be expensed in the current quarter to reduce your revenue. And what WorldCom did was they would say, here's where we are. Here's where we told the street we were going to be. Okay, we're $700 million short. And they would literally pick that up and move it from an expense on the income statement to an asset on the balance sheet. And then they would depreciate it over a much longer period of time.
It's accounting shenanigans, right? I mean, this is basically, without getting into the weeds, it's basically lying about the numbers. And I think one of the very explicit moments that you talk about is 2 words that will never escape my mind, which is prepaid capacity. Why was there this prepaid capacity? And once you saw it, what was the next step?
Yeah, great question. Usually when there's a fraud in a company, it will be perpetrated in more than one place, right? And so that's what was going on with WorldCom. They would kind of pull here and pull here. And a lot of people think that accounting is all black and white. And it's not. There are lots of areas of judgment. So before I talk about like the prepaid capacity, which is, represented a large portion of the fraud, I want to back up for just a minute and talk about how WorldCom actually went for some of these areas of judgment first. So let's say a public company is a penny short on earnings. Often what they'll do is they will go for an area of judgment, such as the allowance for doubtful accounts, amounts that they are putting aside for customers who they don't believe are going to pay their bills. At one point, and you've probably read this in the book, someone came to me from the wireless division of the company. Wireless represented about $1 billion in revenue on a $38 billion company. And he said, look, we're setting aside amounts for customers who we don't believe will pay their bills. And the accountants at corporate, they're reversing our entries. Well, what do you think, Cynthia? So I'm looking at this and thinking, okay, we didn't audit the allowance. And so I decided I would go to Arthur Andersen. Arthur Andersen was the external auditor. They were also the external auditor for Enron. And I would just ask them about this allowance because they tested it as a matter of course. When I go to Andersen and ask the partner about this allowance, he's like, oh, don't worry about Cynthia. It's fine because we're over in all these other areas of the company. So from a total company perspective, everything's good. And I may have left it at that, but I was actually out of the office several days later, and I was at the hair salon, and my husband calls me, and he says, hey, look, the CFO, Scott Sullivan, has called. He needs to talk to you. It sounds urgent. So I call in to the CFO, and, there are like all these people around me, hair dryers going in the background, and he conferences in the controller, and he's not very happy with me. When I explained the situation, he said, look, if you have questions about the allowance, you should be bringing those to the controller, not the external audit partner. Now, I didn't audit the allowance. The controller surely doesn't audit it. And so I said, well, I went to the partner. He's the one who audited. And he became very hostile with me at that point, slammed down the phone. At that point, my antennas kind of went up. If someone is acting in a way that is out of character or they're hostile, as an auditor or a certified fraud examiner, that is a potential behavioral warning sign. And so that made me even more curious. And so I thought, you know what, I'm going to go and pull Arthur Andersen's work papers. And that's what I did. So I went back to work the next day, went to Andersen, got their work papers, got several of my staff in the conference room, and we're pouring through these work papers. And we don't see where they're over in all these areas. And it looks like they're under by, several $100 million. So I go back to the CFO. He says, we're going to bump the allowance up by $40 million a quarter. And based on the rule of 10, by the end of the year, everything will be fine. So I'm sitting there thinking, okay, I don't remember anything about the rule of 10 on my CPA exam, learning about that in my accounting class. There is no rule of 10, right? So ultimately, they did bump the allowance up. They probably just pulled it from some other bucket. But that's one of the first things that we identified that started causing me some concern. Now, if you flash forward and talk about the prepaid capacity, Cass, what you mentioned, that really started with an audit of capital expenditures. So for those who are listening who are not auditors, they'll just have to kind of hang with us here for a minute. But a capital expenditure is, an asset of the company. It's expensed over a long period of time, depreciated over a long period of time. And we had audited capital expenditures before, but we had never heard this term prepaid capacity. So what happened was, in the early stages of this audit, we're given these two schedules that didn't agree. And when I asked one of the finance directors, hey, what's the difference in these schedules? He could easily explain a portion of them out, but there was part of it that he said, I don't know what that is. It's something called prepaid capacity. If you want to know more about that, you'll have to go and talk to the controller. And so at this point, we had access to the company's accounting systems. Arthur Andersen did not. They actually relied on management to provide them with all of the schedules that they needed to conduct their audits. And so I called in. I had about 4 or 5 techie auditors who were, really great on my team. And so I called one of those guys in and I said, hey, look, can you go into the accounting system and see if you see anything called prepaid capacity? And he came back pretty quickly and found an amount in one account with that description, but we didn't know what it represented. And we realized in one of our prior audits that we could only see half of every accounting entry. So the controller, by the way, later testified in federal court that he had intentionally cut my system access and my team's system access to try and keep us from finding these entries. But all we know is we can only see half of the entry. One of my auditors says, hey, look, I know somebody in information technology who has developed this homegrown program that's supposed to allow you to trace transactions through the SAP accounting system. And he's been begging someone to beta test it, and he can't get anybody to volunteer. So he said, look, let's volunteer and see if it works. And basically what it did was give us a backdoor into the accounting system. Now, internal auditors are supposed to have full and free access to whatever we need to do our jobs. And it allowed us to see both sides of this entry. It also allowed us to trace this entry back to what seemed to be its origin and then forward to what appeared to be its final resting place within the books. And so we actually go to the conference room and we get up on the marker board and we're going back to what's known in accounting as these T accounts. We're basically trying to understand all these transfers of entries. They're moving this round dollar amount in and out of all these different accounts that absolutely made no sense to me from an accounting perspective. But once I said, hey, look, okay, when you take the movement out of the middle, you're really left with this large round dollar amount moving from an expense on the income statement to an asset on the balance sheet. My staff were like, so what? There are times when it's perfectly appropriate from an accounting perspective to move amounts from expense to a capital account. Okay, well, we've got this entry. We don't know what it is. But then I get this odd email from the controller. Cynthia, you're totally wasting your time in this area. You should be auditing all of these other areas of the business. This is a complete waste of company resources. And so I emailed back and said, well, we've already started the audit. And then he emails me again, and he's more firm with the second email. We don't have time for this. We are extremely busy working on additional debt financing. They were about this close to obtaining debt financing, which would have sustained them from a cash flow perspective. And so that was kind of odd. So, I get this email, I have this entry, and then several days pass and I get a voicemail from the CFO, Scott Sullivan. So I report administratively to the CFO. He says, I want you to be in my office in 10 minutes and plan to spend a good bit of time with me. I want to know what you guys are working on. So I rushed to his office. This was very out of character. We did not spend a lot of time together. And different people on my team, they're throwing internal audit reports in my folder. I go to his office. He spends some 3+ hours with me that day. And I'm going through different reports and calling in different members of my team. And the first thing he does is to pick up the phone and call the company's general counsel. And I can only hear half of the conversation, but he says, okay, so the audit committee chair is no longer going to be on the audit committee. Is that correct? I think in hindsight, he was trying to send me a message that the person who gives you some independence may not be there for you. So that's the person who I reported directly to. And as I come to this audit of capital expenditures, I decide I'm going to ask him about, well, what is this prepaid capacity? And when I ask him about it, he's very calm. He said, look, Cynthia, this represents telecom fiber that we've leased from third parties that either has no utilization, so no traffic running across the fiber, or very low utilization. And we're so busy with this additional debt financing, we really don't have time to deal with this audit right now. If you don't mind, if you could just delay your audit until the third quarter and look at second quarter numbers, that would be great. That would really help us out a lot. He later testified in federal court that he wanted me to delay the audit and look at second quarter numbers because he had a plan in his mind to fix what he had done, fraudulently moving these amounts from the income statement to the balance sheet. And he was going to take what's known in accounting as an asset impairment charge, effectively writing off all of these amounts in one fell swoop.